Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to our today's lecture. And this time you are not going to listen to me any longer, and we are going to have guest lecturers from now on. And our today's lecturer is Annemarie Verkerk from Saarland University, who is going to talk about quantitative approaches to sociolinguistic typology. So I'm not going to steal any more time from the lecture. So Annemarie, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Hi everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction, Tina. So yeah, we are joined by this one who is going to be disruptive, but we will try to keep it minimal because I was sick and everybody is sick, and yeah, it's a bit of a different change of pace for you guys. But I can share the slides with you guys afterwards, and if things get really bad, which I hope they won't, the slides are also very verbose, so things are going to be okay. I think I can see, or at least I can hear you guys when you start talking. So I don't know how you guys have been doing it so far, but I think it would be quite nice if you just let me know if you have a question or if there's something very unclear. Let's just talk about it, and yeah, that would be the course of action, I think, for today's lecture. So this lecture is basically based on two papers. One is not out yet, so you don't know it, which is good. It's a kind of review of what sociolinguistic typology could look like, especially looking at complexification mostly, or simplification, depending on how you look at it. And then there's the work on Bantu that I've done with Francesca Di Garbo. And we're going to go into some more detail on that, because that is actually as an example of a quantitative approach to sociolinguistic typology. So I'm going to talk about that at some length, and then the rest of it is basically in this chapter. If you guys end up, because I understand that some of you guys are taking the course for credits and you want to, or you need to present a paper, I'm happy to send the above one to you if that's something that you want to do. Just let me know. Yeah, the other one should be online. So we're gonna start from the basic beginning, kind of following on what Xenia has told you guys over the past two lectures. So quantitative approaches to sociolinguistic typology, we're going to pick that apart. Starting with typology, I know you guys have already done this, so this is going to be very fast. So we have some definitions here on the slide. Typology is the classification of languages or components of languages based on shared formal characteristics. So this means that typology involves cross-linguistic comparison. It means that a typological approach involves classification of either components of languages or entire languages, and that typology is concerned with classification based on formal features of language. The other citation that we have there on the slide is by Vilupilai, where she says that linguistic typology is the systematic study and comparison of language structures. So I know that you guys have just had all of this stuff, so I'm not going to talk about it very long. I'm just going to give you guys one example. So just to get into the mode again, here we have a print screen from the World Atlas of Language Structures. And here we have the map on sex-based and non-sex-based gender systems. And of course, we're going to talk about gender systems, so that's why I picked this map. So of course, we have multiple languages here. They are represented by colored dots. We have a systematic comparison here in terms of what the grammatical gender systems of these languages are like. They are either no gender languages, right? These are in white, or their gender system can be sex-based, and the languages are marked in red, or they can be non-sex-based, and then they're marked in blue, right? So these are kind of all the components of typology in one nutshell. Then, to kind of keep going, picking apart at this title, we have sociolinguistics. So here, there's a citation from a handbook. It's also Trudgill, actually. So I know that you guys talked about him or his work well, in the last lecture. But here he writes that regarding this handbook, that social linguistics is obviously concerned with language and society. So we may, without too much distortion, observe as an organizational principle that some work tends to be more language oriented, while some other work is more society oriented. And I don't know how far you guys got with this, but indeed, it seems that social linguistics is really a broad, very, very broad term. So it's broader than other fields of linguistics, I would say, presumably, in the sense that there is definitely this type of micro-social linguistics, which is, I guess, the origin of social linguistics, right? Where we have dialectology, we have discourse and conversation analysis, and then we have work that came a little bit later on language attitudes, but we also have macro-social linguistics, where we are talking about, for example, effects of standardization and language education and what effect that has on multilingual language use within countries, and also, for example, comparing countries and so on and so on. So definitely, we can say that social linguistics is very broad. It's definitely to do with the relationship between language and society, but how that works is quite different in the work of different types of linguists. Where are you going? She wants more of these, which are, yeah, I'm gonna go on how to make the executive's decision to give her another one. It's the last one I own. And we'll see how this goes, because I will have to deal with it tomorrow, as they contain lots of fiber. So those of you that have kids know what I mean. Anyway, we're moving ahead to the next slide, where we are going to talk about sociolinguistic typology. And here you have a picture from a paper that's on genetics, but I think it illustrates some of the things that matter when we bring sociolinguistics and typology together, right? So we are dealing with the interaction between typological characteristics of language and the societies in which these languages are spoken. But what then actually matters, right? So here on the figure you have these lines, right, that depict genealogical descent or language family relationships. So this definitely matters, because languages are in contact often with languages that are closely related to their language, right? So languages that are in contact are often closely or less close related to one another. So within families, there is a certain tendency for languages with similar typologies to be in contact with one another. What does that mean, right? This is an open question. And then there's all kinds of societal questions that matter, right? Society size, interconnectedness. Are there lots of people that are coming in from different communities, from different cultures, or is the society very isolated and does not have lots of contact with other speaker communities? So that's basically language contact, but also environment. So where are you? Are you located on a coastline? Are you up in the mountains, etc., etc.? And all of these things are also interdependent with one another, which makes things less straightforward than one might think initially. So we're going to take a non-quantitative example that I hope that you guys haven't talked about before, and then we're going to move to more quantitative stuff. So the non-quantitative example, and here you have an example, also a very, very, very verbose slide, but it's good. Anyway, the non-quantitative example is Custer's 2003, who investigated different, let's say, language families of a kind of more shallow type than we might suspect for some cases, where he investigates the hypothesis that some linguistic phenomena are more complex than others. And what he means is that complex is in the sense that they are hard to grasp or learn for outsiders. And this has an effect and the society that these languages are spoken in has an effect on what these phenomena look like. So in other words, people that did not grow up in a specific linguistic community, which has specific kind of complex features, will find those complex. And he's looking here at verbal morphology. So he has 4 different shallow language families, as we might call them, with different types of verbal inflection. So it's Arabic with internal modification, Scandinavian, or well, also known as North Germanic, who does fusion, and then Quechuan, who does Urdu suffixation and Swahili with prefixation. And all of these have a specific kind of spread mechanisms, right? So for example, Arabic starts from the Arabian Peninsula, but then has spread over most of the north of Africa. And that's kind of similar for these other families, right? So there's a kind of starting point, and then these languages spread over time through a bigger area. And then what he looks at is what kind of complexity is attested in the verbal inflection paradigms of these languages. So not just, taking Arabic, but taking different varieties of Arabic, taking different Northern Germanic languages, taking different varieties of Swahili. And he studies these, on the one hand, these paradigms of verbal inflection and how complex they are. And then on the other hand, he has he does work on their social linguistics, right? So what do these societies look like? And he distinguishes two types of communities: type 1 communities that have known a degree of isolation, where most speakers are L1 speakers. Speakers' attitudes and symbolic language use are quite important in those type 1 communities. And then he contrasts with type 2 communities who are supposed to be kind of the polar opposites, right? So languages that of communities that have basically readily engaged with other speaking communities. Many are L2 speakers, etc., etc. And then he finds that in each of these shallow families, we find a homeland that is characterized by complex verbal inflection. And we find simplified languages on the periphery, where basically speaker communities have been in touch with other speaker communities. This is most true for Quechua, and least true for Scandinavian. If you think of like Faroes and Icelandic, then you know that there's kind of complexity on the periphery in Northern Germanic, but not. In some respects, it works out for all four of these shadow families. So this kind of goes to show that there is an effect that the type of society that you are affects what your language looks like, right? So there's simplification in light of language contact with other families. So that brings us to what sociolinguistic typology really is. And another Tredgill quote here. So the issue I want to address is the question: to what extent is possible to link the typology of language varieties to the typology of societies? Yeah, that's a nice noise. That is, do different types of society produce different types of language structures, and do they produce different types of linguistic change, right? And so that's the center of this entire approach. So there's obviously lots and lots of work on this. You guys have covered some of Tredgill's work, and it's really a lot, right? So Tredgill, he works in detail on the characteristics. He kind of defines which characteristics of societies could matter, right? Those that could potentially interact with aspects of morphological typology, which are population size, network density, social stability, degree of shared information, contact versus isolation, and then there's a whole lot of qualitative studies that there's really a lot, such as the one by Castert's 2003, that have revealed that it's basically definitely morphological typology that seems to interact with those characteristics of society the most, perhaps. It's a bit of a tough claim to make, but it's definitely true that most work within sociolinguistic typology has been done on morphological characteristics, right? There are a couple of exceptions to this. So there's one paper that looks at complexity as in terms of second language speaker difficulty, specifically for syntax. So you have that in the corner there. And then there's also obviously lots of work, most of it somehow done by Caleb Everett on phonological change and how that interacts with a broad variety of characteristics. Not all of them sociolinguistics, but some of them there. So there's a huge body of work on phonology as well. But most of it seems to be morphology. So I'm really gonna stick to that, and we see where we end up. So Tredgill has basically worked extensively on this, right, and has looked at all of these aspects of society that could potentially interact with with aspects of typology, but especially morphological typology. And then there is this kind of quantitative turn that we can observe in basically around 2009, right? 2009, 2010, where we have people applying various types of quantitative approaches to see on a global scale, or on a global scale, if there are interactions between the type of language structure and the type of society. So this quantitative turn, right, we are in the paper, we kind of hang it up on two papers. One of them is by Kayo Sinemaki. It's called Complexity in Core Argument Marking and Population Size. And it's concerned with strategies in core argument marking, where, of course, I could try and make this interactive and ask you guys what are the main strategies of core argument marking, but I think it's just... Let me get that for you. I think I have too much on my plate to do that, to then also listen to the answers. So I'm just going to tell you guys what these are. So we are talking here about verbal inflection or agreement or indexing or flagging or whatever you want to call it, right? Where you're marking, for example, person and number on the verb. We can do word order, we can do case marking. These are all core strategies to mark in our sentences what argument is doing what. 1 second, I'll try to figure out what she wants, and then I'll get back. I'm not sure what you want. Wil je de telefoon? Yeah. Yeah, okay, that's good. So that's what he's looking at, right? So there's various strategies of doing that. And then, so that's the linguistics part, right? And then he's looking at complexity. He's looking at complexity in those strategies, right? So are basically languages that adhere to the principle of one meaning, one form. Well, that means that a single strategy distinguishes the arguments in all or nearly all contexts. So if you have basically a straightforward case marking system where the case markers have, simple forms and they are marked in all contexts, then you're good, right? And you kind of adhere to the principle of one meaning, one form. Then these languages are simplex, right, in a way. Then if you can kind of violate this principle of one meaning, one form in two different ways. You can violate distinctiveness, which means that you use only one strategies, but you use it in limited contexts, or you allow a lot of syncretism in the head or dependent marking paradigm. So this makes it simple, the system more complex. Or you can violate economy if you use more than one strategy and you don't do it in a complementary manner, right? So there's kind of some kind of vague stuff going on, and basically language users have to figure out what to do in one occasion, and that might not be the same thing as you do in another context. So these are two. So languages that violate distinctiveness or economy are more complex than languages that adhere. And then basically the sociolinguistic measure that he looks at is community size, right? So here you have, at the bottom, you have this table. It's a distribution of complexity values across different community sizes. And then here we have very small communities where we have one that adheres to the one meaning, one form principle. And we actually have 13 languages that violate that principle in one way or another. And then languages on the right-hand side that have over 100,000 speakers, where we have 6 adhering languages and 6 that violate the economy. And if you kind of go over the table, so he has a language sample of 50 languages, and he specifically also targets languages with different community sizes here, right? And as you kind of go down the table, you see, if you look at the adhere row, you can kind of see that increasing, right? So with the increase of community size, languages seem to stick to the one meaning, one form principle when it comes to strategies in core argument marking. So overall, the kind of general result that he has there is that larger populations tend to adhere to the meaning, one meaning, one form principle for argument marking, while small populations tend to deviate, right? They tend to violate distinctiveness or to violate economy. That's the first kind of quantitative paper that kind of marked this quantitative turn in sociolinguistic typology. And then the second one is a very famous one. It's Lupian and Dale's language structure is partially determined by social structure, where they come up with this idea that there are exoteric societies and esoteric societies. Exoteric societies are those which have a large number of speakers that are spoken over a large and more diverse area, that have lots of contact with other linguistic communities, with speakers, and it's the community itself. So the exoteric society is made up out of speakers of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, lots of non-native speakers, and language is used to speak to outsiders. And we have some examples there, what that is. And then on the other hand, we have esoteric societies. We have a smaller population, a smaller area, a fewer linguistic neighbors. Generally, the language is spoken in kind of highly circumscribed locales. So there's a particular political or particular cultural things in which language is used. And the groups are generally more socially cohesive, right? So this is very much in line with what Custers was saying about type 1 versus type 2 communities. And of course, also what you guys have discussed already about Trejo. This kind of goes into what he has discussed in terms of cohesiveness and size and the input of second language learners as well. So what they did, and I have here, is kind of the slide becomes very big. So I'm just warning you. What they did was to look, let me try and preempt it because it's a bit tough. Otherwise, at the same time, I have to check that she does not destroy my phone, but we're all good so far. And they look at walls features where you can easily, so for each of these wall features, you can easily say that one of the variables is more, or more of the feature choices is more complex than the other, right? So for example, for the walls chapter on case syncretism, if you have syncretism, that's more complex than not having case syncretism. Or I can't think of any other examples right now. There's of course a chapter on inflectional morphology at large. So if you have little, then you're less complex than languages that have inflectional morphology present, or even there's a really huge amount of inflectional morphology. So they look at that and then they try to partner that with 3 different sociolinguistic variables. So they have language family, they have some control for geography, and they have population size, right? So this kind of brings up this kind of theme that we find in quantitative approaches to sociolinguistic typology, is that lots of it seems to be about population size. And we're going to come back to why that is, and maybe also what we should do about it later on. So this is a chunk of their table and their results that you can kind of go into. They are basically using a linear model. So if you go to the chapter by Chris and me, if you really want to take on this topic, and I send you guys the chapter, then you'll find that this is we need to take a break. Yeah. Maybe I get you your book. Basically, they do a linear model where they test more complex versus less complex types of language structures in terms of these 3 different models. So either just population, then hold on, let me see. Either just language family alone, or population size alone, or also linguistic neighbors, including linguistic neighbors. And then you have these model fits on the right. But the best way to read the table is basically to go, okay, what are all these different symbols and what do they mean, right? So I'll just kind of help you out here. So for most of these, it's true that demographics and geographic location predicts the typology better than geographic location alone. So there seems to be an effect of society type in the terms of population size that explains something about morphosyntax here. Then also, if you control for language family, the pattern is still significant. That's this bar. Then they also apply another analysis where they kind of shuffle the languages within their families, and the little sun means that the predictive power of population size is reduced if you do that. So there seems to be some, let's call it a genealogical effect on language science that is kind of hidden in the data. If you control for language family, the pattern is no longer significant. That only holds for the one on case syncretism. And then I'm going to skip this one. You guys can just read that yourself if you want to. So basically, there's the takeaway here is that population size is a significant predictor for 26 out of the 28 walls features that they look at. And of course, the geographical neighbors and genealogical relationships, so language family, also predict linguistic features, but they do it to a smaller extent. And then like the last point here is also important, right? So these social demographic variables are not independent in the sense that population size is not independent from genealogical family relationships, and nor is it independent from neighbors either, right? So they argued to basically include all predictors and ensure that the relationships are not spurious. So the take-home message from that paper is that yes, there are aspects of morphological structure that are predicted by socio-demographic variables, by population size. And one explanation for this relationship between linguistic and social structure is the linguistic needs hypothesis, where languages adapt to learning constraints, which in turn are determined by socio-demographic factors in terms of these esoteric and exoteric languages. Yeah. So, but there is a kind of side note here, right? So we were basically just okay, 1 second. Yeah. Just run the job. Yeah. Maybe you should watch some television. Might be a good idea. Okay. Yeah. Watch. So, basically, I don't want to go into this paper too much today, unless you guys have questions about it and we have time. I can already see from the clock that we won't have time. So the paper by Lupien and Dale, together with the paper by Sinamaki, kind of triggered this quantitative turn and triggered all of this quantitative statistical work on sociolinguistic typological questions, was kind of refuted by this Societies of Strangers do not speak less complex languages paper, right? So this is from last year, I think 2023. So Lupien and Dale have been falsified, but I also encourage you to kind of look at that paper and try and compare the two, but we could come back to this if need be. And also it would be a good paper to present if you are one of those credit students. So in the chapter with Chris, we distinguish 3 types of quantitative approaches to sociolinguistic typology. So cross-linguistic statistical analyses, that's what you've kind of just seen 2 examples of, right? So the Sinamaki paper and Lupien and Dale, they started this kind of large number of different types of cross-linguistic statistical analyses. And basically what these do is there is a so-called dependent variable. This is typically some measure of complexity or some kind of present absence of some kind of typological characteristic. And these are then statistically associated with 1 or more predictor variables. And these can be population size, percentage of adult learners, endangerment status, use as a national language or not, and all these kind of different things, right? Then we have language learning experiments. These revolve around simulating language change in the lab by teaching a real or artificial language to participants of an experiment and measuring how well these fare in terms of the participants learning the respective structures. So typically we have experimental groups that are then kind of contrasted in terms of their language, right? So you can have English speakers learning that language versus I don't know, Nepali speakers, and you see what happens, how they differ in learning those languages. Or sometimes they're contrasted in proficiency, or we have a group of child participants versus a group of adult participants. And this is how they kind of try to pull apart what matters, right? What matters in terms of what kind of input do these speakers need, and what is kind of outputted in various iterations as they have in these language learning experiments. And then the third type is agent-based computational simulations. These explore communication in its diaphony through so-called agents that communicate with one another. So this is all on computers, where there's different parameter values, and their interactions can be explored by manipulating the types of messages the agents are allowed to send to one another and the communication setting at large, right? So you can introduce noise and see how they react to that. You can introduce choice of less complex versus more complex rules and see what happens to those over time as well. So I'm going to give you guys one example of each, and then we're going to have a more insight into the cross-linguistic statistical analysis by looking at the Bantu paper. So language learning experiments, in the chapter we discuss at some length this paper by Verkerk and Simonooks in 2022, where the aim is to show the effect of imperfect learning on morphological inflection in an artificial language. And in this study, the participants were Russian speakers. Is everything okay, Xenia? Because Zoom is telling me that my internet connection is unstable. All good?
No, I think everything works fine.
Okay. Stupid messages. I know, it's coming. Wait, you have to wait. And they created this. It's gonna stop if you do that. It's like the 10 bazillion times I've told you that. They created an artificial language where nouns take plural suffixes and also verbs take agreement suffixes, right? So there's kind of double marking of number within this artificial language. The plural is marked with a regular l suffix on nouns, and agreement with the noun is marked with the suffixes on a verb, which can be o or e. And you can kind of see that in the picture here. So these are the nouns, right? There's a noun for different types of so this round animal is called a seg, and the multitude of that, so a plural of these round animals, a group of them all together is called a segu, and so on, right? And then if you have different types of events here. So for example, the seg can fall apart, right? Then the seg does mo, right? It's weird that we talk about an artificial language in English. Anyway, the point being is that this O here marks that it's a singular seg that's falling apart, and here all of the segs are doing it. So there's an O there. Hold on. That's weird. I think actually that's a mistake in the paper, actually, now that I think of it. It's always when you do this kind of stuff that you see a kind of weird thing happening. Anyway, the point is that, yeah, what is it that you want from me? You want the butterflies? Yeah, here they are. The participants learn this language with the help of these mappings between sentences and pictures, and then they create output for the next iteration, right? So they have to learn this language. They're told, okay, here are these segs and fevs, and these are types of sentences. These are types of events that you are expressing with these language, these words, basically, right, with inflection on them. And then they are told to create new output, right? They are confronted with pictures and they have to describe, okay, what is the seg and the fav doing in this picture, and so on and so on. And what's kind of crucial here is that they do have different groups where they have imperfect learning. Some participants, they give only very limited amount of learning, right? And they have basically not acquired the full artificial language in it, but they still have to create output, right? And what happens if you start out with people that are very poor, you know, they don't have this system learned very well, or you introduce such speakers into the system as you go through iterations, is that what you find is that the verbal agreement system is prone to disappear over several generations of learning. And this effect is more pronounced when you have these non-native learners with less exposure to the artificial language. When these are introduced, this effect becomes much more pronounced, right? So here they are, it's maybe strange for you guys to call this sociolinguistic typology, but the point is here that we are learning a little bit about how language use, and especially how multilingualism matters when it comes to creating linguistic structure, right? So even though this is just it's not even a real language, right? It's an artificial language, and the people that are learning it are Russian speakers. Nevertheless, it helps us shine light on this hypothesis of the relationship between society and language. Let me put it back, and then so so that's the language learning experiment example. Then we go to the agent-based computational simulation. Here you have another example. Here it's Juskly et al. Where they have, that's what the paper is called, a social approach to rule dynamics using an agent-based model. And here the aim is to show the impact of characteristics of societies, basically population size, different types of learners, and population turnovers on the emergence of inflection. And they hang it, it's basically about irregular versus regular past tense, right? So this has been especially, not just especially, in English, this has been a hot topic, right? So how do learners learn irregular inflections, so the past and the past perfect, and how has diachronically what has happened, right? So we have some frequent verbs retaining irregular past and past perfect inflections, and we have other verbs that then become regular, right? And there's all kinds of studies on those. And what they want to do is they want to simulate that with this agent-based approach. And their setup is that agents communicate with one another using inflected lemmas. And for these inflections, agents have 12 rules to choose from. So that means that you can have, you know, a vocabulary could in theory emerge which has several competing rules. And each of them can become regular, right? In the sense that it applies to the same number of verb types as the next. So you could have a system which becomes really regular, where you have one way of creating the past tense, or you can have, depending on the verb, you could have different rules, right? And then individual agents in the model mature over time as they learn the language, so they adjust their generalization strategy accordingly. And less proficient agents, they token generalize by looking at their vocabulary and extending the rule which has been used most frequently across all tokens of any type. And more proficient agents type generalize across their vocabulary by extending the rule which applies to the most types in the vocabulary. So you can either get kind of verbs with specific rules to get the past tense, or you can have kind of a regular past tense that kind of fits over all different verbs, all different lemmas. And regularization is kind of conceptualized as the spread of usage of one inflectional rule to the majority of lemmas. So they let these models run for different amounts of interaction. So for example, let me see here, this is the figure from their from their paper, where you have S stands for a speaker and R stands for a recipient agent. They are chosen from the population, and S, the speaker, picks a lemma from the token list. Either it has no inflection for that lemma, right? Then it has to pick one, right? You can choose if it has no inflections at all. So when it's just starting out, you get a random selection. if you have some inflections, you can pick these according to how many tokens you have seen. So either you have seen very few tokens, and you just pick the most frequent one, the most frequent inflection that you have seen. But if you have seen many tokens, then you kind of start attaching specific inflections to specific types of lemmas. And this is the one that you communicate to the recipient, right? And recipient tries to understand what the speaker has said, right? And then you have basically, after that happens, you have a kind of, you adjust basically the weightings of various lemmas and inflections after communicating, and you update your inventory. So both the speaker and the recipient. And what they find is that after long runs of interactions, so 100, but they also manipulated this actually, the larger populations of agents. So for example, if you do it 100, so if you have 100 agents in your population, you have systematically more regularization behavior than if you have smaller populations. So smaller populations, you can basically get away with having irregular past tense marking, but you cannot do so in larger populations of agents. So this is, of course, even in a way further away from, you know, studying language variation in all its glory, because it's basically being done on a computer. But it shows us something about the dynamics that could also play a role in society when there are different types of societies, and also when there are, you know, when you're using actual linguistic units. So this is so their study is improvement on an earlier one where they were just sending vectors to one another. So here at least we have kind of lemmas and inflections or things that match that, which makes it harder, which makes it more close to what actually language use could be like. I'm gonna take, look, there's a break slide after this one. It's great. Hold on. Yeah, it happened. So I'm gonna take a really quick break and try to build or even put a different video on for her. 1 second. Okay, we have still quite a bit to cover and we are running out of time. So we're gonna start with this work on Bantu gender. This didn't help. Why not? Should I make it a bit louder? I think Zoom is pretty good at getting rid of background noise, especially when it's music. Anyway, so this is work by me and Francesca from 2022, where we were looking at Northwestern Bantu gender systems, and especially what can explain variation in these systems in terms of what we call here socio-geographic coordinates. So I'm going to start with explaining a little bit about what Bantu gender systems can be like, and then we're going to go into the statistics of modeling this a little bit more. So what do Bantu languages look like, right? This is Mokwe, spoken in Cameroon, and it has a rather typical Bantu gender systems. It means that it has overt gender markers. They look like this, right? And then, so we see them on the nouns, and we also see them on various targets. So for example, here on the verb, the woman eats, where the subject is indicated with the marker ah. And what is so special about Bantu, of course, is that they have tons of different nominal classes, right? So up to 20, I don't know, up to 23 of them have been reconstructed for Proto-Bantu. Some languages still have lots of classes, so up to 19 or 20. Some have a bit fewer, around 10. And another thing that they morphosyntactically do is that they pair up with number, right? So we have here class 1 noun, or class 1-2 noun actually, which in the singular has this prefix, and in the plural it has that prefix. So the classes typically go together where there's typically a singular, so class 1-2 nouns are typically for humans. Then we have type 6, 7 nouns, or we have type, in this case, we have type 7, 8, 9 nouns. They have another semantic underpinning. So that's really what many Bantu languages are like. And they do that on a range of targets, right? It's not just verbs, but they also do it on a range of things. Anyway, we have another example coming up now, which illustrates that, which is Swahili. So here, again, we have the class. This is marked here with, so these are the singular forms, these are the plural forms, and these form one class, right? And we have gender agreement in Swahili on adjectives, numerals, verbs, including the copula, possessive pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, interrogative pronouns. So it can be really a large list of targets that reflect for gender in Bantu languages. It's really pervasive. But then what happens in Swahili is that, so typically what happens in Mokwe is that we have class 1, 2 nouns that take class 1 or class 2 agreement, right, on all of these targets. And it's really, this is what we call syntactic agreement. The noun is associated with a certain class, and the noun class determines what the agreement pattern looks like across all of these targets. But in some languages, it works differently, and Swahili is one of them. So in Swahili, the animate status overrides the form of the noun prefix. That's what this original source here puts it like. So what they write here is that, in other words, animate nouns prompt the use of the agreement prefixes mu and wa, regardless of the form of their own prefixes. That is, even when they have a prefix different from mu, wa, or have no apparent prefix, and this is the case for nouns, and you can kind of see the various nouns here. You can see the nouns for youth, leaders, prophets, gods, idols, sailors, pigs, cats, dogs, cows. So you can, if you look at all of these nouns, you can kind of see what the pattern is here like, right? I would ask you guys if we're doing a proper interactive lecture, which we are not. They're all animate, right? So this is what the author calls animacy-based agreement, and this is what it looks like. So we have the word for a young person. I think it's this word. It's not glossed, sorry, but nevertheless, it comes from a different class. So but it's an animate noun. So it takes the mu and the wa prefixes in the rest of the sentence. So basically, the key point here is that, okay, we have Mokwe, which has syntactic agreement only, and we have Swahili, which has syntactic agreement, but it also has animate agreement when the nouns are human or animate. They take class 1, 2 agreement. And this is something that we were interested in investigating, like what is happening, where, and how. And then we find some other languages, and the example here is Nzadi, where the class system is in place, but very much reduced, in the sense that we have, on nouns, we have 4 singular nominal prefixes, 3 plural prefixes, and 6 predictive singular plural pairings. So you have 6 classes of nouns when you look at the nouns only, right? But then if you look at agreement, it's basically reduced to marking overtly only a human versus non-human distinction, right? So you can see this only for pronouns, demonstratives, and adjectives. And this is what the paradigm looks like, right? So this seems to be a language which at some point was like Swahili, and then the animacy-based agreement somehow took over to become far more far-reaching, right? So syntactic agreement is lost altogether, and only animacy agreement is left. So I don't know how much time I should spend on this table, because I know it's very daunting. The thing is to remember here is that we have marking of genders on nouns, right? And this can be traditional, like in Mokwe or in Swahili, and it can be also reduced, right? So we also find languages that don't have overt gender marking on the nouns anymore, right? So these are Bantu languages that have basically lost their some of these languages have basically lost or restructured entirely their gender system. And then on the other dimension, we have agreement. So agreement can be traditional, right? Which means that we have syntactic agreement, which means that the agreement, various agreement targets take the prefixes that are determined by their syntactic gender, right? Or we can have it traditional, so syntactic and animacy based, like in Swahili. And then we have languages which are on this row here, where they have been kind of further restructured in the sense that they only have anonymity-based agreement and or with or without number, depending on. And some languages don't have agreement at all, which means that they also don't really have a gender system left, because without agreement, you can't have a gender system. So there seems to be quite a bit of variation. So the languages in bold here are the languages that we added. The languages that Maho studied are in regular fonts. But he was the one who kind of really started looking at, okay, what's happening with gender marking in Bantu across different dimensions, right? So what's happening on nouns, what's happening on the agreement targets. We wanted to investigate this for Northwestern Bantu, which are the languages in kind of non-black. So here we have Northwestern Bantu over here. And because we thought that the agreement system is really central, we look at a huge range of targets, right? And this was part of the challenge for us from a typological perspective, like pulling all of this different stuff apart. So for example, we looked at both subject marking and object marking on verbs. And we looked at what happened on adjectives. We looked at what happens on copulas. So very detailed. And now I want to present you guys what came out of it without losing you guys altogether. Is this okay so far? Especially this idea of looking at what gender marking looks like on nouns and on agreement targets. We can have syntactic agreement and anonymity-based agreements. I know this one is lame. Yeah. Here comes the crocodile. I don't see anybody speaking up. So I'm assuming that you guys are fine. Otherwise, you have to talk to me, because otherwise it's going to be very boring next 15 minutes for you. So, what does the typology look like when you look at Northwestern Bantu? When you look at what happens on nouns and when you look at what happens on agreements. So we already saw Makwe. I'm not going to talk about it again. We have traditional nominal prefixes, traditional agreements with no sign of anonymity-based agreement in Makwe. Then I'm going to skip Iton. I'm going to go to Lefa. So Lefa has traditional system of gender marking when it comes to nouns, right? And also when it comes to agreement, but it has what we call here instances of anonymity-based agreements. So this only happens for certain nouns. So it happens for human nouns. Like here you can see what happens. So we can maybe have a human noun that's in class 5-6. It's a noun for chief. It can take the class 5 marker, right? This is syntactic agreement. But optionally, it can also take the class 1 marker, which would be anonymity-based agreement. And this only happens for verbs in Lefa and is always optional, right? So there's some anonymity-based agreement, but it's very limited. Then we have Neglima, which resembles Lefa in the sense that you can have both types, right? We can have traditional and anonymity-based agreement, but you can do it basically on all targets, right? So here you have an example of syntactic agreement on the word for long, and here you have, for some reason, there's a typo here. You always find them when you start. You never find them when you review your slides before. So this is the word for long, and it gets class 2 marking because crocodile obviously is an animate noun, right? Then Tomba has also traditional class marking on nouns, and then when it comes to agreement, it's especially nouns that are lexically assigned to gender 9-10. They obligatorily take agreement in gender 1-2 when it comes to the verb, but they retain syntactic gender agreement on other targets, right? So there's lots and lots of variation when it comes to what anonymity-based agreement does. In some languages it's optional, for the other language it's obligatory, but only on some targets, and so on and so on. So as I go through these slides, anonymity-based agreement kind of becomes more pervasive. But I'm gonna also skip some of them because it will take way too much time. I'm gonna skip Lika and talk about PMO and Uqueo. So here we have a very interesting transition cases that are kind of central for when we want to talk about what happens diachronically in with Bantu gender systems. So in Mipimo and Mipimo, class system is in place. So there are respectively, I think 14 versus 11 in total, kind of singular plural pairings, right? So classes, but then agreement is reduced to marking overtly an animate versus inanimate distinction. And how these languages do that is basically by saying that, okay, in Mipimo, animate nouns systematically trigger agreement in what we can recognize to be gender 1-2, because the noun prefixes have cognate forms throughout most of Bantu. While the pairing 7-8 is systematically recruited for inanimate agreement, right? So we can kind of see that this is leading towards a system like that of Nzadi, which I introduced in the beginning. And in Nukuyo, it's quite similar, except that it's just a prefix of class 7 that's used to mark agreement with inanimate nouns. And there's no plural correspondence, right? So the E prefix is number invariant. Okay. And the kind of the outcome of, if that is going further, right? If Mipimo and Nukuyo are developing further, they end up being very similar to Nzadi. And then we have languages that are even more comprehensively restructured gender systems. I'm going to give very few examples of this because it's going to take way too much time. Here we have Kako, but I'm going to look at Pande. So in Pande, we have gender marking of nouns basically entirely eroded, but we find that the former class 2 marker, ba, right? This is the plural of class 1, the Bantu human class. That's now a general plural marker for both animate and inanimate nouns. And then when it comes to agreement, Panda has a productive system of subject-verb gender agreement. That's all it has, right? There's no other agreement. And it's completely based on the distinction between animate and inanimate nouns. So there's you can see the pig will die versus the rain will stop. There's basically a different marker on those verbs, and that's it. And then there are languages which have even further basically lost their gender entirely. And this is also the case for, which is important for you guys to remember, it's also the case for two creoles or contact varieties of Bantu, which is Kituba and Kinshasa and Ghana. So again, we are always kind of contrasting these two things, syntactic agreement versus animacy-based agreement. And what we are doing here is kind of plotting what variation looks like. So we have here the number of targets that take syntactic agreement, right? So yes, Mopwe, here are Iton and Lefa, they take lots of targets, take syntactic agreement for these languages. And then on this side, we have the number of targets that take animacy-based agreements. So here you have Nzadi and Kake. And then here we have very few languages that have no gender left at all, right? So we decided to, well, split them up into 4 types. So the black, there are languages with syntactic agreement only. So in case you are wondering why there are not, so they are jittered, right? The points are jittered. So Mipiemo has 4, but if you would just be, using these counts, they would overlap with one another too much, right? So we jitter the points a little bit. There's no language that has like 5.1 targets or something like that, right? This is just for illustration. But we have languages that have exclusively syntactic agreement. These are the black languages over here. They have 0 targets for animacy-based agreement. And then we have languages that take both, right? These are in blue. They are basically filling up this part of the plot. But interestingly, of course, this is only very sparsely populated. So that means that if languages take syntactic agreement, they tend to take animacy-based agreement on a moderate number of targets, right? So below 5. Neglima and one other language are the outliers here. And then in orange, we have languages that take animacy-based agreement only. And in green, we have languages without any gender, right? And this is going to come back when we look at the sociolinguistic aspects of what influences these morphosyntactic characteristics. We're going to again look at this plot a little bit and see how we can typologize that a little bit further and look at measures. So what does that look like on a map? It looks like this. So we have here an entire zone here of Northwestern Bantu, which is very varied, but where there's actually basically only syntactic agreement. And then we have this almost like a diagonal band across the central, the Republic of the Congo, that kind of has Annemarie-based agreement kind of abounds. And then in green and orange, we also have languages that are completely restructured. And these we also find suspiciously on this area, right? So this marks the area, the northern Bantu borderlands, where we have non-Bantu like the Congo language over here, and then we have Ubangi and then Central Sudanic over here, right? So the orange languages and also this green language here, without any gender, they seem to be suspiciously close to non-Bantu languages, right? We should remark here that these languages don't tend to have Bantu-like gender systems, right? So Ubangi is Niger-Congo, but it has a very different gender systems. The Central Sudanic is the same thing, right? The Central Sudanic is not Niger-Congo, and but they have, some of these languages have sex-based, so masculine, feminine, or masculine, feminine neuter systems, but they don't have anything what resembles Bantu systems. So what does this look like on a tree, right? This is what we kind of wanted to look at. So what are the patterns, not just from a geographic perspective, which I just showed, but also from a genealogical perspective. And what you find is that in the clip, so this is maybe a bit hard to read. Anyway, so this is Proto-Bantu. And then we have stuff kind of, yeah, I don't know really how to best read this. I can't really help you very much. These two clades are the top of the Bantu tree. They are closest to Proto-Bantu. And this is kind of one clade further down, which is the kind of group that has gone through the rainforest towards the east of the Bantu expansion. And what we find is, because what we wanted to see is whether languages that have similar gender systems also patterns closely together in the family, right? So this would mean that what type gender system you have is not just random, right? But there is some kind of phylogenetic signal, right? And this was important for us because we wanted to use phylogenetic comparative methods to study change in these gender systems. And as you kind of look here, there's on this kind of these groupings that are closest to Proto-Bantu, there's actually relatively little Annemarie-based agreement going on, and it's mostly in Central Western Bantu actually that we find this. And also what we find is that there's groupings, right? So you can look at these languages here, they form a clade here. They are forming a closely related grouping, and they tend to have similar similar gender systems. Okay, we're getting there. We're getting there. Yeah. And we also have very, very little time left. So I'm going to skip this. It's very interesting, but we want to get to the sociolinguistic aspects of this study, right? So how do we explain this? And our hypothesis was that there could be, so the idea is that pervasive Annemarie-based agreement is a result of language contact, right? There is some work on this from an experimental perspective, actually. The idea being that gender systems are more transparent and more easily learnable if they're based on Annemarie, rather than these kind of opaque types of syntactic agreements. So I should say that in Bantu, Annemarie definitely plays a role, but doesn't explain all of the assignment of classes. And it's also, I mean, there's just so many classes that I guess it's for a second language learner, right? It would be really hard to learn a system with, I don't know, up to 14 or 15 classes. Yeah, so this seems like a very feasible hypothesis, right? And we had to kind of talk a little bit more about the specific Bantu contexts in which that such language context could have that outcome, right? So the first would be that there could be creolization through second language learning. So I told you guys about Kituba and Lingala. So these are two creoles where we have millions of speakers, and indeed these languages have lost their gender system altogether. So this seems a likely explanation for those. We have, as we saw on the map, we have language contact with Ubangi and Central Sudanic language speaking communities, languages which do not have Bantu-like gender systems, which could be a factor in explaining this anonymity-based agreement. And then we have another thing that we wanted to investigate is this idea that there could be substrate effects from non-Bantu neighboring communities in the past. So when Bantu spread through the rainforest, basically most Pygmy communities, well, not most, all Pygmy communities ultimately switched to Bantu and have gone into these kind of society, well, from a societal perspective, very interesting relationships with Bantu speakers. But we don't know what their languages were like because basically all of these people just switched, right? But it could be the case that in switching, we could find substrate effects in the sense that they have simplified these Bantu languages in the past. So what do we do? We are using basically BMRS, which is a very nice R package, which does phylogenetic generalized linear models in R. And we wanted to investigate the effect of these social and environmental variables on the distribution of our types of gender systems. So what did we do? We are doing two different things. So first up, we look at the target counts as a predictor. No, as a response, sorry. We look at what socio-demographic variables can explain the number of targets that take syntactic agreement and the number of targets that take anonymity-based agreement. And then here, instead of the kind of four-way typology, we also use a binary response variable where we just said, okay, we're gonna contrast basically type 1, which is the traditional type, versus type 2 and 3 and 4, which is basically languages that have rather limited anonymity-based agreement up to no gender left at all. And of course, from a methodological perspective, this is not ideal, but I think one of the takeaways from this lecture can be that linguistics is complex and it's not always easy to, so very often it's kind of impossible to come up with the ideal models when we want to investigate a certain question, right? Yeah, should we watch some more? Yeah, we can do it. Yeah, it's okay. So it's, from a statistical perspective, it's not a good idea to use intercorrelated measures of anything and then run several analyses, right? Because you are increasing the chance that you find something that isn't there, right? So you increase the chance of type 1 errors, but that's how it is. So how did we measure language context? There's lots of apostrophes here, because this kind of points towards one of the problems that we find in sociolinguistic typology. Lots of it seems to depend on this particular variable, right? So I've started with you guys with the quantitative turn in sociolinguistic typology, 2 papers which are both about population size. This work that we did also worked with population size. And that's simply because Ethnologue has this data set where it has, for most of the language of the world, it has the population size, right? It has the number of speakers, actually. And yeah, you guys can think about that for yourselves, if that's a good idea or not. What does that capture, right? It does capture that, certain speaker communities are larger than others, but it's perhaps not a very good measure it's not a good sole measure of what a society is like, right? I think we can all agree on that. Nevertheless, that's our kind of main sociolinguistic variable. And then the rest of them have to do with geography, because we saw on the map that this seems to matter quite hugely. So we are modeling language latitude and longitude, whether language is on the border with Ubangi or Central Sudanic, and whether the language has a present or past location in the rainforest. Actually, there's two of these, whether it is presently in the rainforest or whether it's in the past in the rainforest. And this was related to this idea that we had on substrate effects, right? So pygmies were the original inhabitants of the rainforest. The Bantu speakers migrated through there, but also some of the Bantu languages are still there. We wanted to capture that. So hence the term sociogeographic correlates, right? What does that look like in the languages of our sample? Most of the languages have an ancestor in the rainforest. So the Bantu expansion went from north to south and from west to east, which means that most of the languages that are east have an ancestor in the rainforest, in the sense that a part of the tree that they connect to was once upon a time, presumably in the rainforest. Other languages other speaking communities with their languages moved more to the south, and these don't have an ancestor in the rainforest. So some languages are still in the rainforest, and others don't, right? And this is then per type. So we actually find that type 4 and type 3 languages, so those with the most heavily reconstructed language, the most heavily restricted gender systems, actually don't tend to be in the rainforest very much at all. This is because they are actually spoken to the north of it, or kind of these languages went through the rainforest and then kind of went to the other side where Ubangi and Central Sudanic languages are. Most of them don't have a border with Ubangi and Central Sudanic, but some of them do. And then here are the same stats for a number of L1 speakers, latitude and longitude. So I'm gonna very quickly continue with the results. So here we have results on the binary model. I know this is a very boring, so let's start over again. Yeah. Is it okay? You should have something to do. So this is the results of the binary model. This is output of Bayesian estimates of the coefficients, right? So the estimates of the coefficients. And what happens is that they have, so what you can basically think of is a kind of confidence estimates. So if the distribution of estimates does not cross zero, that means that there is pretty good evidence for an effect that's significant, right? So when we are doing Bayesian statistics, we don't really talk about significance. We talk more about relevance, but it's hard to get the word significant out of your brain. So you can think of the ones that don't cross zero, right? Like the border of with Ubangi and Sudanic for this model, to be a relevant predictor, right? So the same goes for current rainforest overlap, and that's all for the binary model, right? So the reference category here is having only syntactic agreement. So what we can say about this figure is that languages that have a type 2, type 3, or type 4 type gender system tend to be on the border with Ubangi or Sudanic, and they tend to have actually a lower rainforest, currently rainforest overlap. Then we look at, the next two plots are about the number of targets, right? So this one is about the number of targets that take syntactic agreement. And here we have a couple of relevant effects. We have the more syntactic targets you got, so the more syntactic targets the more targets that inflect for syntactic agreement, the less likely you are to share a border with Ubangi, and the more likely are you to have a lower number of L1 speakers. So, hold on. And then this is the analysis or the output for looking at the number of targets that take animacy-based agreement. And again, here we find a couple of significant effects. Again, the more targets that you have animacy-based agreement for, the more likely the language is to have a border with Ubangi or Sudanic. You tend to have a lower latitude and a higher longitude. So that means that you're further east. So this is basically kind of reflecting the map that I've already seen you guys, and the other effects don't matter. So I'm gonna quickly go over this. So and this is because this is the most relevant one for you, right? So this is the number of targets that take syntactic agreement, and here we have a scaled number of L1 speakers. This is just to kind of show you guys one of the problems that we face in sociolinguistic typology, especially if you look at a specific area or a specific family, as we did. The problem is that you have outliers. And so even if you scale things, and we did this very carefully, you have, magnitudes of difference between most languages, which are spoken by quite small communities, and then a few outlier languages which are spoken by millions and millions of people, right? And this is definitely the case in Bantu, but it's also the case around in other areas of the world, right? Or in other areas of the world, for example, if you think of Australia, where you have lots of indigenous languages that are quite small, but you have English as well. And there's all kinds of conundrums that you face there statistically. So what happens is that I showed you guys this effect that we had, but it seems to be triggered by the difference that you can kind of see here, right? So it looks like languages that have no targets that take syntactic agreement have a higher number of L1 speakers than languages that take a couple of targets, right? And so you can see the effect is more. So this is a zoomed in version. So on the right, we have the zoomed in version of the plot on the left. You can kind of see how pronounced that is here, right? And this basically seems to trigger this entire effect. And what matters here are these outliers, these 5, 6 outliers. So there's 3 here, but there's also a couple of here that trigger that effect. So if you actually throw those out and you repeat the analyses, actually the effect goes the other way. So what happens with population size is that's bimodal. So a few languages with no syntactic agreement have a high number of L1 speakers. If you remove these, a higher incidence of syntactic agreement is actually associated with larger population sizes. So there are different effects going in different directions. Then longitude and latitude, we already kind of saw that. They have relevant effects and they match kind of the distribution on the map. So that's not super interesting. The most interesting actually one is the one variable where we code for the border with Ubangi or Central Sudanic. So languages sharing that border are more likely to display Annemarie-based marking or have no gender. They have fewer targets agreeing syntactically and a larger number of targets that display Annemarie-based agreement. And then present and past location in the rainforest was actually kind of a disappointing thing for us. It does not seem to matter very much, or the effect goes in the other direction as we expected. So ultimately, kind of reflecting on that is that, okay, we do find this effect, which kind of holds, even if you do more aggressive control for genealogical relationships. But it doesn't, it's just a geographical effect, right? So we can surmise from this that there is something about the contact with languages that do not have a Bantu-like gender system that seems to trigger Annemarie-based agreement coming in, but that's about it, right? So it's somehow, it's nice, but somehow you want to know more, right? So kind of summing up and taking some methodological points for the future. So our analyses show that sharing a border with Ubangi and Central Sudanic languages and population size are the most relevant predictors of pervasive Annemarie-based agreement and the erosion or loss of gender. And whereas for present and past location in rainforest, it's not great. And here we really wanted to think about better proxies for capturing that. So we're gonna try this again and see if that's something that could matter if you measure it in a different way. So the analyses on Annemarie-based agreement show kind of greatest sensitivity to contact effects. So if you look at especially the target counts for how many targets we get Annemarie-based agreement, that really seems interesting. So this kind of shows that using different types of typological measures, especially when you're dealing with complex morphosyntax, it has consequences for what you find, what your output is when it comes to social linguistic typological. Then the effect of population size largely depends on outliers. So we have many languages spoken by very small communities and a small set of languages that are spoken by several millions of speakers. And this suggests that we need better proxies for this idea that we had where realization can emerge through second language learning, which is still a very interesting hypothesis. And we definitely think that this is what happens for some of the languages, but capturing it just by population size basically does not work. And then some of the effects also depend on including the type 3 and type 4 languages. These are the most reduced languages in terms of their gender system. And there's only 17 of those, right? In an entire analysis of looking at 180 languages. So some people actually also, reviewers said, you have to throw these out and see if they matter. Is it everything okay? Celia seems to, okay, yeah. But we think that including these languages are crucial if we want to understand what language contact does, specifically from a diachronic perspective, and also especially in light of how common type 2 languages are, right? So animacy-based agreements can be very minor, as we saw in some of these languages. It can affect only one word, it can affect only one target, it can be optional, and it can basically be very, very pervasive. So we really want to have some way of studying this from a sociolinguistic perspective while taking account of how it seems to work linguistically, right? So this is the end of the Bantu paper. So they are online, you can look them up, find more info there. But that's basically the gist of it. And I want to kind of continue with an outlook. I would take 1 minute, but we don't really have a minute. She seems quiet. So I'm going to basically continue with an outlook, which is based on the chapter by Chris and me. So first up, granularity and the way we measure things that are linguistic really matters, right? And in the chapter, we have an example there on case marking. So case marking in Varus and in German for the word they. And you can see, if we look at that from a distributional perspective, so we have 7 forms in. See, I should have taken that break. So in Varus, we have 7 forms. I don't remember what they all are, but they must be stuff like accusative, nominative, genitive, locative, and stuff like that. In German, we have 4, right? And we can look at the number of tokens, and then we have this kind of distributional case marking analysis. We can also look at that from a paradigmatic perspective, where we see that, and we can see lots of differences between the distributional measurement of case in Varus and German, right? So in German, Tage is really the most frequent token. Whereas in Varus, we have Degi and Dag as the most frequent ones, and the distribution looks quite different. In the paradigm, we see that the reason for that happening, right? And we see that German has a form Tag, which is really Tag and Tage, which are really popular. They occupy several slots in their paradigm. Whereas in, sorry, I'm trying to find my cursor again. Yeah. In Varus, the paradigmatic perspective is still very varied, right? We have lots of different forms. We only have one that occurs in 2 slots. But then if we look at that from a perspective of walls, where we aggregate data, we basically have both of these languages having 4 cases, right? So in some ways, you can easily say that not even the paradigm not even kind of does justice to the distributional measure, and definitely the aggregated measure does not do justice to either of them, right? And this is something that in typology, but also definitely and also in sociolinguistic typology, models are sensitive to this kind of stuff, right? The confirmation or rejecting and hypothesis about how case interacts with aspects of society probably crucially hinges upon the level of aggregation, which means that what could happen, what could happen as an effect of society on language depends really on what you are measuring from a linguistic perspective, right? What's hard for speakers that might want to simplify a system like that of Farus in German is probably not that they have 4 cases, but it's probably related to something like the fact that there are 4 singular forms and how they are used in which context in Farus, and the distribution on the paradigmatic approach captured that much better than aggregated approaches. There's really only a few slides left, people. You guys, you're gonna make it. Sorry, is this not working? So the same goes, of course, for measures of population structure, right? So there is a kind of proliferation. So if you look at different studies within sociolinguistic typology, we have all kinds of stuff going on, right? We have population size, network density, social stability, shared information, contact versus isolation, fragile. Then there are tens of different ways in which you can operationalize these. And every study seems to come up with different measures. Some are related, and so on and so on. Yeah, it's not easy then to assess how do these relate to one another, and what can I then really say about the relationship between society and language. So there's lots of open questions here, right? Do these actually capture those aspects of population structure or social relations between and within communities that include grammar? Do these measures correlate correlate with one another, or are they independent? And then I had as a third point here, we find that the mechanism is, or not the mechanism, that the link is always the same, right? Do we find that simplification comes with the influx of L2 speakers everywhere around the globe? But I saw in the poll before we started the lecture that you guys have already figured out that this is not the case, right? So there seem to be cases where we have shared multilingualism situations, or small-scale multilingualism situations, where there is multilingualism for centuries, but it doesn't lead to simplification, right? So there's all kinds of different things that are happening. It's not just simple, okay, you speak another language, so therefore you simplify either one of those. So to quickly come back to linguistic complexity and grammar, again, here, there are multiple ways. So like we saw just for case, there's multiple ways to measure grammar, right? There's also multiple ways to measure complexity, lots of different ideas about that as well. So here, there's a recent paper there cited that showed that they seem to kind of speak towards the same phenomenon. But on the other hand, very general statements about differences in overall grammatical complexity are unlikely to hold, simply because there's really different ideas about complexity. And these different ideas result in kind of variance in how you can measure complexity across languages. So even within morphology, we have some morphological markers that seem to have relevant effects when you do look at population size, for example, case markers, while others do not, right? So it's not just about morphology as a phenomenon, right? It's about specific markers that presumably have a specific challenge for a specific type of language user that show up as relevant in these types of analyses. Then another point that we have to make is statistical models and their usage and interpretation. So for Bantu, you guys saw that it's really not easy to apply these models because you have all kinds of different restrictions. So for example, for Bantu, I didn't talk about that, but the genealogical control that we had there was branch within the family, and you have some branches that are huge and you have some branches that are small. It's not straightforward to deal with from a statistical perspective at all. So overall, the trend has been to kind of increase the complexity of models by adding more and more fine-grained methods, including phylogenetic and geographic information, including different predictors and so on and so on, but this also decreases the statistical power of statistical models. So we should also be interested in interactions that do not hold globally, but that hold only in specific areas or families. And then we also have to think about the relationship to experimental studies, right? So iterated learning experiments, they measure typically things on a very highly specific dimension. So for example, these nouns and verbs that in the artificial language that we saw. But statistical studies, especially those that are making use of typological databases like WALS or GramBank or AutoType, right? They're often quite coarse. So this also goes back into what you are measuring, how you are measuring it, and how that interacts also with the type of statistical tests that you are using. So none of it is especially straightforward. And this is really the last slide, people. There is a disconnect that we noticed when we were writing the chapter between sociolinguistic typology and the study of language acquisition. So basically, within language acquisition, both first and second language acquisition, there is tons of data and knowledge about what's hard for people, what's easy for people, right? But there's no systematic overview of how this literature can speak to hypothesis generating in sociolinguistic typology. So this also goes into things about like how are people learning the language. So aside from population size and interconnectedness and amount of isolation, the way in which people are learning a second or a third language, right? It must also matter when we look at the effect that it has on the typology of the languages in question. Yeah, I'm not going to read the last sentence. I think we are already over time, and you guys have been very silent, and I've been blabbering for a very long time. So this is the very, very, very last slide. And we can talk about questions if you guys are up for that.